Welcome everybody. My name is Diana Gomez. I am the Civic Engagement Volunteer for Frida Friday and a co-founder of La Politica. Both organizations are helping put together the series of candidate forums. We believe it's very important for folks to get civically engaged on a local level and to be informed on what these local elections are, what these positions are. And so what we're doing is we're bringing these candidate forums to you and asking questions that are really important to Black and Indigenous people of color. So want to thank our forum guests, which are the candidates for Judge Court number 4, which is the domestic violence court, if I believe that's true. Yeah. It's specialized in that area. And so here with us, we have Margaret Chen Kercher and Dimple Malhotra. And so I will be asking a series of questions, and they will last about 2 to 3 minutes long. When there are about 5 seconds left in the answer time, I'll put my thumb up just to let y'all know. Thank y'all for coming and for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us. This is really a wonderful opportunity to talk about a very important court.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'll start off with our first question, and that is, and I'll start with Judge Dimple. So first question, County Court at Law Number 4 is the only specialized domestic violence court in Travis County. Do you think it is important to have a domestic violence training and knowledge to serve this court? Why or why not?
I think it's critical to have domestic violence experience, training, and knowledge to be able to sit on the bench of this court. As you mentioned before, this is a domestic violence court. It hears primarily domestic violence cases. And having experience with domestic violence means that you understand the complexities and the nuances that are involved in these cases. I have 20 years of experience doing this work. For 13 years, I was a prosecutor in the Family Violence Unit. I was also the head of the county's Protective Order Division, and I spent 6 years out of law school working at nonprofit domestic violence shelters. I also have the experience of growing up in a home where domestic violence was occurring, and so I bring that perspective with me as well. And what is so critical about experience is that it allows you to properly and efficiently assess the risks that we know are involved in these cases. There have been several studies that have been done to gauge the efficacy of domestic violence courts, and the research suggests that if you have a domestic violence court and you have a judge that has experience on that bench, it leads to greater outcomes in terms of offender accountability, victim safety, reduced recidivism, and also changes the experience of victims who have been dealing with the issue of domestic violence. Also, this court hears protective order applications for victims who have experienced sexual assault, stalking, and domestic violence. And so we know that because domestic violence is an epidemic, we need to address these issues very carefully. And that is why specialty courts were created in the first place, to allow judges who have experience to handle these cases in a consistent approach.
Awesome, thank you. Margaret, would you like me to repeat the question?
No, I think I have the question. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
One of the things that I want to stress is that simply because I've come from a criminal defense background does not mean that I don't have family violence experience. I defend my clients, defendants, who are charged with these types of offenses. But more than that, I think that even though County Court at Law Number 4 has a preference for family violence cases, that doesn't mean that other types of cases outside of the realm of family violence don't come in to County Court at Law Number 4. And that's been particularly true during the time of the pandemic, where County Court at Law Number 4 is hearing more than just family violence cases. But even if it just hears family violence cases, it is important to have a judge who, well, the job of a judge is to be fair and impartial, but it is important to have a judge who can think about the breadth of these types of cases. And that's really important when you're talking about trying to figure out if there's an alcohol issue, a controlled substance issue, possibly a mental health issue. There are all types of other issues, not just family violence. So we have to look at the whole picture, balance these issues that come before the court, and make sure we are balancing the defendant's rights with the victim's safety and the community's safety. And that's why I think a breadth of experience representing people in different types of criminal cases matters, and not just looking through a narrow lens. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So I'll start off this question with you, Margaret.
Sure.
Even though County Court at Law Number 4 is a criminal court, this court also handles protective order hearings for victims of abuse and sexual assault. What policies will you put in place to ensure victim safety during these hearings?
Sure. So a lot of these protective order hearings, what we're looking at is to make sure, first of all, that when we have a hearing, that's where the determination comes into play, right? Whether or not this protective order should be an order in and of itself. We can't make any sort of predeterminations. Yes, there can be a temporary protective order prior to this hearing, but it's at that hearing where you make those determinations. And at that hearing, you can determine whether or not this person needs to have a stay away, whether or not these two people need to stay away from each other. You also need to make sure whether or not there needs to be, if there should be any contact, for instance. Now, these are some of the things that we talk about. The other thing that's very important is that firearm surrender, or even a weapons forfeiture. We need to utilize that program. I believe the constable in precinct number 5 has this program set up so that there can be weapons forfeiture. So those are some things that we can look at. Additionally, we can look at bonds. A lot of times these protective order hearings deal with people who may have a companion criminal case. And with that companion criminal case, we can look at what types of conditions we can put on those bonds as well. And that could include something like GPS, if that's necessary, EM, electronic monitoring, if that's necessary. So we have many items at our disposal to consider when we're trying to figure out what is the best for victim safety.
Awesome, thank you. And Dimple, same question.
Thank you so much. So I'll tell you what I've done so far. One thing that I noticed when we were hearing sexual assault protective orders, they were being held on Friday morning, which was the busiest day in court. And you would often have an applicant testifying in a packed audience about very intimate and personal details regarding the request for a sexual assault protective order. So one of the first things that I did when I got on the bench was I moved every contested sexual assault protective order hearing to Friday afternoon when almost no one's in the courthouse. I believe that both parties in that respect deserve privacy. Also, the other thing is, when we're talking about protective orders, what you're ultimately talking about is risk assessment. And so again, I go back to experience in order to be able to make a determination about whether or not a person should walk away with a protective order. And a protective order is a very serious thing. It infringes on someone's liberty and ability to move freely about. And so you really do have to take that into consideration very seriously and have to weigh the information and the evidence that's presented. And I rely on my experience. Every time I hear a protective order, I go back to my experience, and that's how you make a determination about the risks involved in a case. With respect to firearms, that's something that is statutorily defined. It also, just to make it even more clear, I spend a great deal of time, anytime I'm issuing a protective order, I make it very clear to the respondent what the terms of the protective order are. I spend at least 10 minutes going over every single term of the protective order. When it comes to firearms, if I have any reason to believe that the respondent has or has previously possessed a firearm, I put very specific orders in place, not just what is statutorily required, but I go the extra step of saying, if you have firearms, you need to immediately relinquish those firearms, and you need to provide the court with a receipt indicating that you have relinquished those firearms to the Travis County Sheriff's Office, and provide that receipt to the court within 48 hours. If you are saying that you do not have firearms, then you must provide an affidavit of non-possession, which is a sworn affidavit stating that I am not, nor have I been in possession of any firearms or ammunition. And so those are two things that I require as a standard practice because we know that there is a strong nexus between gun violence and domestic violence.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just to clarify for folks that aren't familiar with this court, a lot of judge positions are elected positions. And Dimple, you have actually been on this court. Can you explain sort of why your campaign sign says Judge Dimple? Like, were you appointed, or how does that work out for folks that don't know a lot about this court? And
yes, thank you so much. So I was appointed last fall by the Travis County Commissioners Court. The judge who had been on this bench for 20 years, Mike Denton, retired last fall, and both my opponent and I interviewed for this appointment, and the Travis County Commissioners Court appointed me in a 4-0 vote. And I've been on the bench since November 1st. And of course, now with the pandemic, things have been somewhat different than I imagined, but we have been hearing protective orders every Friday. That's our protective order day. And on the other days, we handle the criminal, misdemeanor, domestic violence cases.
Thank you. So you're the person currently in that seat, the incumbent. And there were there other folks running for this position, but now this is a runoff?
Correct. There were, I believe, 19 people who applied for the appointment. And after the appointment, myself and my opponent, Ms. Kercher, as well as Ms. Tanisa Jeffers, were in the primary. And now it's just the two of us in the runoff.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. And so for the next question, I'll start off with you, Dimple. See, there is a deal of discussion around the backlog at the county court at law number 4. Please explain this backlog and how you will address it.
That's a great question. So the backlog is something that I inherited when I took the bench, and it, is a reflection of the number of cases that we have filed into County Court 4. This is the busiest court, and the reason for this is because domestic violence is an epidemic. The Center for Disease Control has labeled it a public health crisis. In Travis County alone, we have almost 4,000 domestic violence misdemeanor cases that are filed into this court every year. And these cases often don't move quickly. They're unlike any other cases because they are complex and they are nuanced, and there are several different variables involved. And so when I interviewed for the appointment process, and I'm sure my opponent did this as well, we presented a plan on how to address the backlog. And I immediately put that plan into place when I took the bench. I added double the number of jury dockets. I took all the non-intimate partner violence cases that I don't feel need to be in this court, and I moved them all out into different courts. And I changed the way that I run the docket. This is really up to the judge to be able to do this. This is something that involves docket management and leadership skills. And so in making those changes and running the docket in a different way, having every attorney approach me when they want to reset a trial, I need to be a part of that conversation so that I understand exactly the reason for the continuance, and it's not just made for the purpose of delay. And so with all of those measures within the last 6 months, we've been able to see a reduction in the backlog by over 25% as of today.
Awesome. Thank you. And Margaret, the same question.
Sure. As of July 1st, I believe there's something like 2,900 cases pending in County Court at Law Number 4, which is roughly 600 cases more than the next County Court at Law that handles misdemeanors. And so I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is, as long as there's this heavy load in County Court at Law Number 4, the backlog, we're denying justice on both sides. Justice delayed is justice denied. And here are some things that I think we could do to improve that backlog. First of all, I think one of the things that did happen was that the non-intimate cases did get moved out. That doesn't necessarily mean that they've been disposed of or resolved. They've just been put in the mix in different courts. One of the things that we can do is to make sure that even though we have jury dockets, that none of those jury dockets are wasted. There are unfortunately a lot of cases that are on the jury docket that probably shouldn't be on there. And so we need to make sure that cases that are not on there are removed, and that jury dockets are for cases that should be tried, right? And those announcements made by those attorneys need to come in on that jury docket day. Secondly, we need a pretrial diversion program. This pretrial diversion program would reduce the number of active cases, reducing these numbers for first-time offenders. Now, I understand that, you know, the first time somebody's been arrested doesn't necessarily mean that it's the first time this incident has happened. However, the only way we can reduce family violence long-term is to start the conversation on improved treatment. So that's kind of a two-part deal, right? We need to make sure that treatment is improved upon, and on top of that, we need to make sure that first-time offenders are given the opportunity to improve and rehabilitate themselves. The other thing that I think would really help is to make sure we are addressing the root issue. And that goes back to making sure we address drug issues, alcohol issues, and if there is a mental health issue. We need to look at the bigger picture. And that's why I think breadth of experience is important here. So those are some things that I would do to address the backlog.
Awesome. Thank you, Margaret. And I will start with you with this next question. Police brutality is a national issue with a local concern considering APD's history of police brutality. Please confirm whether you have interviewed for APD's candidate endorsement, and if so, how do you plan on rectifying this?
Rectifying the issue of police brutality?
Of interviewing for APD's candidate endorsement.
Oh, sure. So yes, I did go and interview with the Austin Police Association, because I think the only way we can affect change is to ask for change. I'm not going to change anybody's mind by declining their invitation. And so and on top of that, I also believe that the other thing is that nobody's above criticism, right? All witnesses that come before the court, nobody is going to have this perfect record. So I think it's important that I come to the table. Now, I think that nobody would disagree that I didn't get that endorsement, and I certainly did not take any money from them. And if I had gotten the endorsement, I would have rescinded that check. I would not have taken that money. Now, and that's really all I have to say about that. I will say two things. The reason why I took that invitation to speak with them is to see if, you know, we can come to the table about change. And the second thing is, I haven't disclosed anything that is false or dishonest about what has happened in that process.
Awesome. Thank you, Margaret. Okay. Dimple, same question. Please confirm whether you've interviewed for APD's candidate endorsement, and if so, how would you plan on rectifying this?
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, I did interview for the APA endorsement, and I did receive the endorsement. However, I've not accepted any money or funds from the Austin Police Association, nor will I. And also I want to say that I completely, 100% disavow any actions taken by any law enforcement officer that exploit their power and take advantage of the power that they have been given, and exercise that power in unlawful and discriminatory and racist manners. I have, as a prosecutor, prosecuted police officers who have committed domestic violence, and that is an indication of my belief that no one is above the law. And when, you know, we're talking about domestic violence, that especially rings true. You know, as far as a conversation about police officers and prosecutors in general, I'll tell you the reason that I became a prosecutor after working in the nonprofit realm for 6 years was because as an immigrant and as a woman of color, I knew that we needed systemic changes in our system, particularly with prosecutors' offices, with law enforcement's response to domestic violence. And I wanted to have a seat at the table because I knew that my voice as a woman of color and as an immigrant was not being heard. And so that has been really important for me. And I think that is the way that we see change in our systems and in our institutions. And so I've always been upfront about my endorsement, and but in no way does that ever mean that I condone any of the behaviors of officers who commit police brutality or use excessive force against any of the citizens in our nation.
Thank you. I'll start with you, Dimple, for this question. Please explain why domestic violence is a public health issue, and how do you plan on addressing it?
Thank you so much. Well, domestic violence is a public health issue because of the statistics that we see that reflect that this is something that is happening in epidemic proportions. In just Texas alone in 2018, we know that 174 women were murdered by their intimate partner. We know that 32 men were murdered by their partner just in that 1 year alone, and that's just in Texas. We know that domestic violence is an epidemic that disproportionately affects communities of color. We know that more than 1 in 3 Latina women will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. So this is something that absolutely has to be addressed. And I've committed my entire career to this issue. Having grown up and being exposed to domestic violence, I bring a holistic perspective to this issue. I know how dangerous it can be, but I also know that the impact of conviction and incarceration, what that means to a family, especially a family of color, a family who might be here that is undocumented or struggling with just basic issues.
Thank you. Okay. And Margaret, same question.
Sure. The reason why family violence is a pandemic or is an epidemic is very much real. The fact that it is climbing up in the numbers in the CDC polls, it makes sense, you know. However, I will say that it is important, though, that we don't, as judge, and swayed simply because there is an allegation of family violence. We need to make sure that we don't translate allegation to conviction. And of course, you know, as judge, we also want to make sure we still keep the family safe, we still keep the victim safe and the community safe, but also not tread and impede on the rights of the defendant. So yes, it's an epidemic, but I think the thing that we do here is to make sure that we change and improve the Batterers Intervention Program, which is the type of rehabilitation and counseling that most defendants are required to do. And that is a long conversation. That's not something that's going to be fixed overnight. But if we really want true rehabilitation and a reduction in family violence, then that's the conversation we need to be having instead of being okay with the status quo. There have been mixed results with Batterers Intervention Program, and what we need to do is to see if there's some way, and that this would include a conversation with all stakeholders on how to improve that.
Thank you, Margaret. Alrighty, this will be the last question, and we'll start with you, Margaret. What makes you qualified for this judicial seat?
Sure, I appreciate that. And thank you very much for having us on, Diana. I will want to mention one thing, which is, you know, there is a mention of the appointment process. And I think that there is a huge reason why in Texas, we still believe in the election process for judges. And that's because then you know that you are electing a judge who reflects your values and your progressive values. I will say that I don't know if this is a nonpartisan organization, but this race in itself is on the Democratic primary runoff, right? And we want to make sure that those values are reflected upon on the judicial bench. We can't tell you as judicial candidates what we will do or what we will support, but I think it should be, if we are Democratic leaders, that we hold those democratic values. And I think the reason why I am the best candidate for this bench is I don't think my democratic values have been, I think they have been displayed here in the community. First, I've been a part of several boards of Democratic clubs here in town. Secondly, I have gone out to Carnes Detention Center to help those who are seeking asylum to come to the United States. Most of them are from Central America or South America. And lastly, I believe in the community in helping them in nonpartisan ways too. I've been on boards where it's of nonprofits, where it's communities, families helping other families in the community. So those are my democratic values. And on top of that, I think what's really important is if we're going to talk about experience, it's about breadth of experience. It's about knowing what it's like to be in all types of cases, from not just family violence or not just sexual assault, but all traffic tickets to murders and to all bits and pieces of what it entails to be in a trial and defending somebody. And I think one of the things that we need to make sure is that this judge, whoever's judge of county court at law number 4, is fair and impartial, because it is their job to listen to both sides of the equation.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Dimple, same question.
All right, thank you so much. I think that I'm the most qualified for this bench because a big part of the job for the county court at law 4 judge is to do risk assessment. We're talking about bonds. That's a big issue when someone comes to you and says, can this person be released? And if so, what are the conditions that are appropriate to be placed on this person to ensure not only victim safety, but also the safety of the entire community? So that, again, that goes back to experience, to be able to look at a case, analyze the risks involved, and make those determinations so that our safety, the victim safety, is not compromised, while also protecting the constitutional rights of the offender or the accused. The other thing that's really important is trial experience. Now, as the judge of this court, you are typically going to be hearing jury trials. And so you have to really understand the laws. You have to understand the how to conduct a trial. I am the only candidate who has first chair trial experience. I've been doing trials, first chair trials, for 13 years now. And even before then, I was handling protective orders and hearings and family law cases. And also what is important is management experience, to be able to do things like take a docket that I inherited and reduce it by 25% within a few months requires the ability to lead and the ability to make decisions that you know are sound and will have an impact. And then what I really want to stress is the understanding of what this issue is and what it means to our community. We just saw the brutal murder of a soldier in Fort Hood, Vanessa Guillen, and someone didn't believe her. Someone trivialized her experience of sexual harassment. We cannot allow that to happen anymore. My opponent has referred to domestic violence as relationships gone awry. That trivializes this epidemic of domestic violence that is plaguing our community and our society. And this is not just a woman issue. This is a human issue. And it's something that we have to pay attention to. And all of this, the ability to do this, to run this court, to make accurate determinations of the risks involved in these cases, and to protect the people that are involved, whether it's the accused or whether it's the alleged victim, all of that comes down to experience. And I have 20 years of experience handling these cases, not because I'm a political person, but because I care about this issue, and I have. After graduating from law school, I became an advocate, even though I was a licensed attorney. I became an advocate because I care about domestic violence and how it impacts our community.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. That was it for our questions. Want to, again, thank y'all for having the time to talk to us, to answer these questions. I hope folks that are watching take this opportunity to get to know more about the candidates and to vote early. Early voting ends July 10th, and election day is July 14th. Thank y'all again, and I can't wait to hear more from both of y'all.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Diane. I appreciate it. Thank you.